Hey everybody, thanks so much for being here this afternoon. Happy Friday afternoon. I'm Katie Earl. I'm the coordinator of our University Express program, and we're joined with Patrick Ryan, who is in the Buffalo History Museum. So before we turn it over to him, we'll do our quick intro. We're in a different setup today, so you can display your video if you want others to see you. If not, you don't have to. That's okay. Seeing that Patrick should be really big on your screen. If you have any questions or comments for him, feel free to type that in the Q&A panel. You'll find that at the bottom of your screen. You can send your questions right to me. So quickly, we'll thank our sponsors, which is our Department of Senior Services, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Western New York, Excelsior Orthopedics, and Wegmans for all their support. And Senior Services is at 858-8526 if you ever need anything. And we are recording this session, and I'll try to post it on our website in the near future if all goes as planned. All right, the star of our show. Patrick Ryan is the education coordinator at the Buffalo History Museum. He's originally from Buffalo and attended Buffalo State College to obtain his degree in history. His specific field of focus is 19th century antebellum America, which includes slavery, politics, and constitutional theory. And he's here with us. Patrick, thank you. It's all yours.
Of course. Thank you for that introduction. That was nice. Hey, everybody. Like she said, my name is Patrick Ryan, and we are here at the Buffalo History Museum. If you've never been here, we are on our third floor, and this is our Native American gallery behind it. And when we get started here, we're actually just going to head right over here. So before we can really talk about anything, even a couple hundred years ago, we have to talk about the things that happened thousands of years ago, because a lot of people just think that, when European contact happened, that's kind of like when everyone moved into the area, but that's definitely not true. There were groups and different peoples that existed here for thousands of years. And in this case right here, we have some of the oldest things that we actually have on display anywhere in the museum. And when archaeologists go to these dig sites and they find, old objects, stones, things like that underneath the soil, they use it to kind of learn a little bit more about the cultures and the groups that lived there before. So for example, in this case right here, right near number 6, kind of that thing with a few teeth on it right there, that's actually going to be an early variant of a hairbrush dating from about the 1400s, so 700 or so years old. But in this case right here, I would say that my favorite pieces are actually going to be these along the back. So those two pieces back there are ceremonial peace pipes. And peace pipes, especially to, the Native Americans in the Northeast kind of region, exactly kind of how the name sounds. Let's say there were two chiefs or two groups that were in a fight. To kind of symbolize the end of that fight, they wouldn't sign a treaty. Instead, they would smoke out of tobacco pipes with each other. And what's kind of interesting about these is that these kind of interesting and intricate carvings that you see right there, the one with the face and the one with the bird, I actually learned relatively recently that those are pretty unique to the Great Lakes area, and really only the Haudenosaunee Iroquois would have made pipes with this kind of design on it. And we'll head down over here too. Now, in this case, the things that we have for you are not thousands of years old like the last one, but they are definitely still pretty interesting. Now, when I say the Haudenosaunee, or as you may know them as the Iroquois, who am I talking about exactly? Well, on this cane right here, we call this our Chief's Roll Call cane. And on it, you have 5 of the nations represented with the name of the council founders next to them. So listed on this cane right here, we have the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. And now there is one missing from that list, and we will talk about them in just a few minutes. But in front of this kind of piece right here, you're going to see our council wampum. Now, wampum essentially is a shortened version of the word that means little white beads, which is perfect because that's pretty much what they are. But to the Haudenosaunee, kind of like those ceremonial peace pipes, wampum was a tool, or I guess jewelry, used to symbolize peace, and would often be presented between two warring factions, chiefs, or whatever the case may be. And over in this case, this is probably going to be one of my favorite items in here, which is kind of interesting, but my favorite because a lot of people don't know what it is. And the main guess that I get is a shield, which I kind of see that, with kind of the handle up there, like you could almost hold it like that. But in actuality, this right here is going to be a mid 19th century, so think 1840s, 1850s cradleboard. So definitely different than say like a crib you would see today with a ton of, either pink or blue pillows and things like that on it. But a cradle board back then, they would have stuffed it with hay, perhaps animal fur, say deer or bear. And the main reason why we have this piece in here is to kind of illustrate how back then, obviously, there were no stores, there were no merchants really for them to, trade with. So everything had to come from the natural environment. So kind of like everything we've looked at, it's either stone, it's either wood, all things that come from the surrounding woodlands in the Northeast. And the next thing that we're going to look at right here, it's also a pretty old piece. It's been in the museum's collection since 1940. So it's almost like an artifact in itself. And that's going to be our Native American diorama. Now, being built in 1940, not everything in here is necessarily useful by today's, historic research. But there are a few things that we can still kind of look at in here that are at least of interest. And the first thing that we're going to see here is this kind of wall built right here. Now, many of the Haudenosaunee villages, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, whatever the case might be, they had to think about, many dangers basically living out in the middle of the forest, whether it was other tribes or, even animals. Nobody really wants a bear wandering into your camp in the middle of the night. So one way that they kind of, solved this issue was they would take logs and trees and actually build relatively sizable walls along the outsides of their villages. And this at least allowed them to sleep a little bit more soundly at nights. But other than big walls, I think that most people, when it comes to the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois, are definitely most familiar with their longhouses. And the first one that we see here is going to be a longhouse in progress, not quite built yet. But as you can see, essentially they would take large trees, again, to go up and down the sides with saplings that they would bend across the top to kind of give it that rounded roof so that water wouldn't sit on it. And as you can see, this gentleman down here carrying that large piece of bark, bark would be used on the outside to keep out the snow, the rain, and all other things that you don't want when you're living in Buffalo in the middle of the winter. And on the adverse side of that, you are going to see a completed version of that longhouse. Kind of what's interesting over here is if we take the camera and just look through the top, I know there might be a little bit of a glare, but all of these longhouses, they were definitely long and they could house multiple families. This wasn't just a one family house. Sometimes you could have even over 100 people living under one roof. And the way that they did that was through almost the use of like bunk beds, which might be a little tough to see from up here, but many times they would have rows of beds, 1, 2, 3, sometimes even 4 high. And this allowed obviously a stronger sense of community with everyone living under one roof. And it allowed for body heat and fire to be shared much more easily. Because again, middle of the winter in Buffalo with no furnace or anything like that, it's going to be bitterly cold. And the last thing that we'll talk about our diorama here is going to be in this corner over here. And like how I was kind of talking about earlier, being kind of out in the forest with no real roads or anything like that at this time, it was pretty hard to travel across New York State. You got to think this is dense woodlands at this time. But one thing that definitely kind of opened up the surrounding area quite a bit was the use of streams, rivers, and even lakes. Many Haudenosaunee villages were built around bodies of water. And that was obviously for a few reasons: drinking water, place to bathe, place to catch fish and eat food. But once they mastered canoe building, using a canoe could cut down travel basically more than half. And this kind of opened up trade between the other tribes in the area and eventually Europeans. And above this very diorama, we kind of have a more full scale version of what a Haudenosaunee canoe would have looked like. Cool. And the next thing that we'll talk about is actually going to be over here. You can get a little bit more of a view of what a longhouse would have looked like. We went from a very, very mini longhouse to still a small longhouse, but a little bit bigger, so you can see a little bit more. And we're actually going to walk right inside here. So on my right, your left over here, you're going to see kind of what I was talking about with that bunk bed style sort of sleeping arrangements. Now, obviously, we're already inside of a building, so we couldn't make it too high, so we only have one. But many times it would be, like I said, 1, 2, 3, and sometimes even 4 high. And as you can see, kind of hanging from here, Once Native Americans kind of ended their hunter-gathering kind of phase, as in they no longer had to follow animals around as their source of food, once they figured out, more sustainable farming techniques, that allowed them to settle down in one place and build more fleshed out communities. And those crops many times are known as the three sisters, corn, squash, and beans. And being able to hang them in areas and use them later, again, allowed them to settle more easily into one area. And the last thing that we'll talk about here is going to be this kind of painting thing behind me, which shows, a traditional kind of Haudenosaunee family, mother, father, two kids, and the grandmother. But the thing that I want to show you about right here is going to be right in the center, and it's what they are using to cook on, which is the fire. Obviously great for making food, because if you go and hunt a deer, it's much nicer to eat, cooked venison rather than raw venison. But the big thing was, especially in those winter months, having multiple fire pits lining down the center of a longhouse allowed them to stay much more warm than, living on their own and not in a longhouse. We will keep going. So the next thing that we're going to talk about over here, and actually probably one of my more favorite portions of the exhibit, is going to be our case that features 6 distinct Gestowas. And essentially Gestowas were ceremonial kind of headdresses that were worn by high-ranking Native Americans, whether they were a chief or, just someone who would have been at the council meetings. And from left to right, we have the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida Mohawk, which we have already talked about. But on the end over here, we have one more, and that's the Tuscarora. Now, the reason why sometimes they aren't included, I guess, is because they are originally not from the Western New York or Northeast area. They actually migrated from the Carolinas in the 1700s and were later absorbed by the Iroquois Confederacy. But what I kind of wanted to show you with these Gestowas is a lot of times when you're learning about Native American history, they're almost all kind of, lumped in as just one category, just Native Americans, but that's not the case. Each tribe and each group, they had their own unique languages, their own unique, style of hunting, style of dress. And this kind of shows, obviously on a very small scale, but a little bit of that. So for example, if it was 1790 and you were walking through the Buffalo area and you saw a Gestowa with one feather sticking straight up and down, you could pretty much guess that that would have been a Seneca Haudenosaunee. Now, if you had seen one, say, with 3 feathers out of the top, that could have been a Mohawk, one with none, and kind of just the feathers round, that could have been a Tuscarora, and so on and so forth. But yeah, I like to use this case to kind of show how, for whatever reason, like I said, a lot of the time they get grouped into just one big group, but that's really not the case. Very unique cultures existing within the Haudenosaunee Confederation. So that's a little bit of, say, like early history of the Western New York area, pre-European contact. So what happens after that? Well, over here in this case is a stuffed beaver, which might be a little weird, but we'll talk about why we have it there. So in 1534, an explorer from France that I'm sure some of you have at least heard of, Jacques Cartier, he travels down the St. Lawrence River and comes pretty close to the Buffalo area. And that's kind of the first time that Native Americans and Europeans come into contact in this area. And the one thing that Cartier notices very quickly is the abundance of the American beaver population in the area. And why would he take note of this? Well, at this time in France, Britain, and other places in Europe, kind of the big fashion statement that everyone wanted was fur gloves, fur hats, fur coats. And with so many beaver around, and because of their kind of very warm fur, Cartier realized that they were the perfect animal to use to kind of fuel this obsession with fur in Europe. And that's where we see the start of the fur trade. Right around 1600, mostly the French, but some British too, and Dutch, they'll come to the area and start hunting beaver. And in just about 40 years, believe it or not, the American beaver population in Western New York is almost wiped out. Now, luckily, in the last 300 years, they've recovered pretty well. If you're going for a hike around the area, Letchworth or Devil's Hole, anything like that, you might see one. But back then, they were basically hunted almost to the verge of extinction. And at first, this kind of contact between the two parties, Europeans and Native Americans, it went pretty okay at first, because in the beginning, it was more of a trading relationship. It's not until we get, more into United States history that we see kind of that taking of land. France and Britain, at first, it was more of a working relationship for trade. Native Americans would trade fur, and the Europeans would trade more European style goods back for it. And these two cases here kind of show that example. Now, this case on the left, this is going to be pre-European contact items that you would find at a Haudenosaunee site. Kind of like the theme that we've gone through a little bit, everything comes from the natural environment. So clay pots, wooden spoons, axes with stone tips and wooden handles. But once you get into, the 16th, 17th century, you'll see the goods found at these sites change a little bit. And that's because of contact with Europeans. You'll start to see silver spoons, iron pots, axes with actual iron handles, and things like that. And like I was saying, things were okay at first, but then things kind of take a little bit of a turn when it comes to European and Native American kind of relations. And the first thing that we'll talk about is going to be right here, and we call it the Great Mortality. So you got to think, if you grew up in Paris and your whole family for generations lived there, if there was a common cold in France, your body was pretty much ready to fight it because your ancestors had done it, you had done it. But when these people came over to North America, the Native Americans here, their bodies were not ready to handle these new diseases. They weren't prepared. And without any fighting really taking place, 10 years go by and the Haudenosaunee population's almost cut in half from about 1620 to 1630, and that's all due to disease. But it doesn't really stop there. Over here, we have another thing that we'll talk about real quickly. And here's kind of the obviously there was fighting before this, but this is kind of a big one that we talk about here. Not only was there disease, but once the American Revolution starts, believe it or not, most of the Haudenosaunee side with Great Britain. Reason being, like I kind of said, they worked a little bit more as a team, a little bit more as a trading relationship than the infant United States or infant to be United States. And the only two that didn't side with them were the Oneida and the Tuscarora. Those were the only ones that sided with the colonists. And George Washington took note of this, and he enlisted the help of a gentleman by the name of General John Sullivan. And he put Sullivan on what is now known as the Sullivan Campaign, basically instructing him to go across New York State through Haudenosaunee land, and basically any land that he saw that wasn't owned by Oneida or Tuscarora, he was instructed to essentially attack the village and burn it to the ground. So, depending on what side of history you're in, you learn a lot of different things about people. George Washington, to a lot of white Americans, is seen as like the greatest figure ever. But to the Haudenosaunee at this time, he actually earned the nickname the Town Destroyer, and that's what he was known as in Haudenosaunee culture for years. So we'll head over here. And once the revolution ends, this kind of spells pretty big trouble for the Haudenosaunee people. Unfortunately, without an ally as strong as Great Britain supplying them, with British regulars, guns, food, etc., their power was pretty much fractured, especially after losing to the Americans. And it's here that we see them kind of not be able to fight back as much. And because of that, and because of the introduction of European-style firearms, guns, flintlock rifles, and things like that, the United States definitely takes advantage of not just the Haudenosaunee, but Native Americans across the United States. But in the Western New York area, there are a couple treaties, and I put quotes around that we'll talk about. And the first one is the Big Tree Treaty of 1797. Now, this is the first treaty that establishes Native American reservations in the Western New York area. And it was supposed to be almost 90,000 acres, but just about 10 or so years after signing the treaty, New York State said, actually, just kidding. We're only going to give you 1/3 of that. And the Haudenosaunee, well, more specifically the Seneca, were only left with about 30,000 acres of land, which might sound like a lot, but remember, they were free to go and live wherever they wanted before this. And the second treaty is during Jackson's administration in the 1830s. Now, if you've been following any of the popular news or anything like that, there has been a lot of question about Jackson and how he treated a lot of people, not just Native Americans. And that's kind of one of the reasons why, at least it was a plan, that he was going to be taken off the $20 bill. But during his presidency, the Ogden Land Company, with his instructions, signed the Buffalo Creek Treaty, which wasn't done properly. It wasn't signed by, the true leaders of the Haudenosaunee. And it was basically a treaty that was forcing the Seneca to move all the way to Kansas, which would have been disastrous because, Native Americans that have lived in the woodlands for generations, that would have been a very tough transition to living on the Great Plains in the Midwest. Now, luckily, public outrage actually stops this treaty from truly taking place. But again, it's just another example of how, without the support from the British, the United States were kind of doing whatever they wanted. And another thing that we'll talk about over here before we kind of get to our conclusion in a little bit is going to be rise. I think we're back. Oh, there we go. The rise of these, what were called Indian schools, which were essentially Christian missionaries that took young Native American children and tried to train them in more European style sensibilities, as in mathematics, speaking English, the arts, things like that, which at the time may have seemed like a noble cause, but in retrospect, now we know that this kind of destroyed or displaced a lot of Haudenosaunee culture because most of their culture wasn't written down. It was all through oral tradition. And with this new generation not really learning from their elders and learning more European style learning, you see kind of a big loss of culture at this time. And we'll head over here. But that's not where the story stops for Native Americans, thankfully. And in this case, we used to have a very interesting item right here. And I'll give you a little bit of a backstory on it, even though you're kind of just looking at an empty case, but that's all right. Right here used to exist the Red Jacket medal. Essentially, after the American Revolution, there was a Seneca chief in the area by the name of Red Jacket. He was known for being an incredible orator, basically just a fancy word for a very, very good public speaker. And it earned the respect of not only his fellow Haudenosaunee, but Americans in George Washington as well. And in 1792, Red Jacket and about 120 other Haudenosaunees are invited to travel to Washington, D.C. and meet with George Washington to discuss peace terms. And he goes there, they have the meeting, and things go actually pretty well. And he's presented with the Peace Medal to symbolize the end of fighting between the Iroquois and the United States government. And the medal is actually very, very interesting. It's a large oval. It's considered to be one of the top 5 most important medals ever given in American history. And again, I'm sorry that you can't see it, but I'll tell you why in a second. But on that medal, you'll see Red Jacket handing George Washington a ceremonial peace pipe, with George Washington pointing behind him and showing more European style farming techniques. So there was going to be a trade and a partnership kind of happening due to this. Now, the reason why we don't have it is actually pretty cool. When we have objects, we always want them to go to their traditional or rightful home. And recently, the Seneca Iroquois National Museum down in Salamanca asked for it back. And who are we to say no? And actually, I think just about maybe like a month now, we had a whole ceremony where we repatriated the item back to the Seneca Nation. So definitely just kind of, we have an empty case now, but that's fine because the object was going to its rightful home. And eventually we'll replace this with something, but that's just kind of a way that, the Seneca and the Haudenosaunee who had lost so much culture during that period can start to kind of get some of it back. And if you've never been to the museum down there, it's definitely worth like the 45-minute drive from Buffalo. It's very cool and the building's really, really beautiful. But that is kind of the end of the Native American Gallery tour, and I can open it up to questions for anybody that might have them.
Patrick, thank you so much for
Of
that.
course.
Your memory is so impressive.
Thank you.
Of course. Okay, so questions that I'm seeing, this one's from back in the beginning. What are the peace pipes made out of?
So oftentimes they would be made out of stone, sometimes clay. It's not until you see like more manufacturing that they'll start being made out of like ceramics and things like that. But the early ones would have been stone.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
This next one is, what were the winters like back then for the Iroquois? Were they similar to now? More snow? Do we even have any idea?
Well, I don't know if it was any more or less, but even if they were exactly the same, that's still very, very cold and a lot of snow.
I agree. I'm just seeing like two more things here. This next one is what was the average life expectancy back then for them?
Um, so off the top of my head, I don't know exactly for Native Americans, but I would say like the average life expectancy in general, if you're counting, Europeans too, was probably around 60. People didn't really live as long as they do now because conditions weren't really as good.
All right, thank you. And then this last thing here is I had heard that the Buffalo area was a general use slash hunting area for all of the native groups, not territory claimed by one of the seven groups. Is that true?
I believe that's true. So it was never technically, we'll say owned, although that's not really the right term, by any of the groups, but they all did come to this area to trap and trade and do things like that. So yes.
Thank you. I'm seeing, so Jim, I'm not sure if you're meaning to raise your hand, but if you want to put what you're saying in the Q&A, that would be awesome. So we can give that a second. This question that just came through, how many Native Americans actually lived in Erie County?
So it is tough to kind of know the true number because there weren't really any records, say, done, but it had to have been close to or over a million probably in the Western New York area. It was a very, very large number, and a lot of people don't really consider that. I feel like a lot of people are taught, like, yeah, there were small groups here and there, but no, like, these were pretty extensive communities throughout New York State.
Thank you, Patrick. And then somebody asked, so do we have any idea about how many are in our area now?
That is a good question. It's something that I should probably look into. I haven't gotten that question before, and that's something that I'm not going to try to answer because I'm not exactly sure how many Native Americans live in the area now. Sorry, I don't have that one on me.
That's okay. Better not to guess. Okay. This person says, so what was the story about the extra nation?
Oh, so essentially, there were five nations that lived in this area before, but the Tuscarora, they're actually from the Carolinas, mostly North Carolina, South Carolina. And due to whatever reason, we think that there might have been some fighting down there. They actually migrated up north and were absorbed by the rest of the Confederacy in the 1700s.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Jim wanted us to know there's a longhouse at a museum about 45 minutes away.
Oh, yeah, that's cool. I would love to go and check out a full size one too. I know ours is a little, but at least you can go in it.
Exactly, get a little hint of it. So not sure if we know this, but how much land do the Native Americans actually own now in our area?
Whew, again, I don't know the exact dimensions or the exact amount today, but I should add that to my list of things to learn for future questions.
All right, well, that's fine. You gave us a lot of information that we appreciate, so no
Of
worries
course.
there. We
Thanks.
have someone says, I'm impressed with your display.
Thank you. Yeah, so this gallery, it's been here for a while, but it's been updated relatively regularly every, say, like 5, 10 years or so. And one of the things that I'm pretty proud about it is that we actually work with the Haudenosaunees, specifically the Seneca, to kind of ask them how they sort of want to be, how they want their story to be told. And a lot of the things that you see in the cases, like the Gestowas, for example, actually came from Iroquois. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm sure they appreciate having the input too. Let's see. Where is the gallery again? Thanks.
So the museum is at One Museum Court, Elmwood Ave, like right across the way from the Albright Knox, pretty close. We have all the pillars and Abraham Lincoln on the back if you're ever in the park. But this exhibit is on our third floor. It's nestled right between our Icon Sports exhibit and the future home of our Erie County Bicentennial exhibit. So we are up here on the third floor.
Awesome. And then, Patrick, will you give us the hours of the museum, please, and maybe any considerations people need to take in before visiting right now?
Sure, yeah. So we are no longer technically asking for a mask. I still wear one. I feel a little bit more comfortable with one on. And the hours right now that we're looking at are going to be, let me think right now, because they're constantly changing. Cheyenne's behind the camera. 10 to 5, Wednesdays through Saturdays. I wasn't sure if we had reopened on Sundays yet. So, yes, 10 to 5, Wednesdays through Saturdays.
All right, thanks, Patrick. And
Of
something that just
course.
came through is I have been to many Native American ceremonies, and I would encourage everyone to try to attend one if you can. They graciously welcome us all.
That's true, and that's I got to see a little bit of that during the repatriation ceremony at the Iroquois Museum. They did have sort of a traditional ceremony, and it was very welcoming and very kind of interesting to see. So, yes, whoever asked that question is definitely right.
That's wonderful. So I'm not seeing anything else come through right this second.